You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Hello, and welcome to Ben Franklin's World Revisited, a series of classic episodes that bring fresh perspective to our latest episodes and add deeper connections to our understanding of early American history. And I'm your host, Liz Covart. In May 1775, the delegates of the Second Continental Congress gathered in Philadelphia, a city bustling with political intrigue, economic ambition, and imperial tension. As we discovered in our recent conversation in episode 411 with historian Paul Kahan, by the time the delegates arrived, Philadelphia was not just the largest city in British North America. It was a dynamic center of dissent, diplomacy, and revolutionary ferment. This May 2025, marks the 250th anniversary of the Second Continental Congress. And to help us continue our commemoration of this important milestone, we're revisiting episode 202 about the early history of the United States Congress. We'll explore how and why Congress took its current form after the American Revolution under the United States Constitution, and how the new bicameral legislature departed from earlier forms of representative government. In this conversation, we'll rejoin two historians from the Office of the Historian of the United States House of Representatives, Matt Wasniewski, the historian of the House of Representatives, and Terrence Ruckner, a historical publications specialist. Together, Matt and Terrence will help us discover how early Americans designed their national legislature based on past experiences with the First and Second Continental Congresses, the origins and development of the House of Representatives, including its early structure, procedures, and precedents, and the enduring legacy of the early Congresses and how their work shaped the federal government that we know today. Are you ready to revisit the formation of the United States Congress and discover how revolutionary ideals became enduring institutions? Let's go rejoin Matt and Terrence. Joining us, we have two guests. First is Matt Wasniewski, the historian of the United States House of Representatives. Prior to his appointment as the historian of the House, Matt served as the historian and deputy chief in the House of Representatives Clerk's Office of History and Preservation. He's edited several publications, including Women in Congress, 1917 to 2006, and in 2004, he helped create the House's first oral history program, which has collected hundreds of hours of interviews with former House members and with longtime staff. Second, we have Terrence Ruckner, a historical publication specialist in the Office of the Historian at the United States House of Representatives. He assists with editing the online biographical directory of the U.S. Congress, and he's a contributing writer to the 4-volume series Minorities in Congress. Terrence has also served on the Executive Council and as the president of the Society for History and the Federal Government. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Matt Wasniewski and Terrence Ruckner.
Thanks for having us on the show.
Thank you for having us.
Okay, the fact that the United States House of Representatives has an Office of the Historian seems like a really great and interesting place for us to start our conversation. So, why exactly does the House of Representatives need an Office of the Historian? Matt, would you tell us a bit about the Office of the Historian and the types of work that the historians in that office undertake and perform?
Yeah, absolutely. The history function for the House is something that's relatively new in the big scope of things. We first had an office created in the early 1980s, the Office of the Bicentennial of Congress, to prepare for the bicentennial in 1989. And that eventually became the Office of the Historian. And currently we have a range of functions. We really see ourselves as a public history office in the sense that we are here to answer questions that anyone's got about the history of the House, its past practice, its past members, long, rich history. But we're also here as the institutional memory for the members and the staff of the House. So we have two audiences, on the Hill and off the Hill. We do everything from answer reference questions, again, a good number of them coming from on the Hill, but probably the majority of them coming from the general public and the press and scholars about all aspects of House history. We maintain the House's major historical publications. including the Biographical Directory of Congress, which we maintain with the Senate Historical Office. And that provides brief biographical sketches of every member of the House and Senate, more than 12,000 individuals going back to 1789. It also covers delegates to the Continental Congresses and Articles Confederation Congresses. We have written a series of books that was mandated by the House and Senate on women, African Americans, Hispanic Americans, and most recently Asian Pacific Americans in Congress. And in 2004, we started an oral history program. And to date, I've conducted north of 300 interviews, audio and video, with long-serving staff and members of the House. So we have a lot of different functions and, like I said, a full-service public history office.
Wow, it sounds like you do a lot of different work and a lot of different reference work. And I guess this makes sense because we know that when members of Congress want to make a case for something, they often turn to history to make that case. But the curious thing to me is that you said that the office of the historian was not founded until the 1980s. So what did members of the House do prior to the 1980s when they had questions about the history of Congress or past actions and bills approved or disapproved by Congress?
That's a great question. So our office was created at a time when there was an emphasis within the federal government on public history offices. It was in the wake of the U.S. bicentennial. Prior to that, there was founded in 1962 a group called the U.S. Capitol Historical Society by a member of Congress, Fred Schwengel, who was a former high school history teacher from Iowa. And that group focused on Capitol history, House history being part of it, but really Capitol Senate history as well. Prior to that, well, we now have a group in the Library of Congress called the Congressional Research Service, and they were founded in 1914 as the Legislative Reference Service. So I suspect most history-related questions probably went through the Legislative Reference Service to begin with.
And besides the Legislative Reference Service, there were general reference librarians within the Library of Congress. There was a House library and a separate Senate library so that members of Congress and the general public could access that. And for many years, there was the Law Library of Congress, which was used by not only members of Congress on the Capitol Hill, but also elsewhere throughout Washington, D.C. But we're happy to serve as a one-stop shop for people with questions about the history of the House or how to research it.
Speaking of the history of the House, Matt mentioned that the House's Office of the Historian deals with a lot of questions about the early Congresses of the United States. And that's a perfect topic for us to take up. So, Terrence, would you tell us about the establishment and functions of the first Congresses of the United States, the First and Second Continental Congresses?
Yes. The First Continental Congress was formed to send a unified response to Great Britain in opposition to the Coercive Acts, which was a series of 5 acts designed to punish the Massachusetts colony for their protest of taxation laws that culminated in the Boston Tea Party incident of 1773. Through the spring and summer of 1774, legislative assemblies selected delegates to participate in this colony-wide forum. Many of the delegates had not worked with each other personally prior to the formation of the First Continental Congress. Some of those key delegates included John Adams of Massachusetts, who rallied support for such a collective assembly and encouraged others to get involved. George Washington of Virginia, who had aligned himself with some of the more radical members calling for independence. He not only served as a delegate, he also served as a military affairs consultant before the Second Continental Congress selected him as the senior commander of the Continental Army. The First Continental Congress only met for about a month, and when they adjourned, they had drafted a Declaration of Rights to list their grievances and state their rights as colonial citizens to the British. And they also drafted an association, which was a mutual agreement on curtailing imports and limiting exports toward Great Britain. They also left an option to meet later on if it became necessary. By May of 1775, that necessity became a reality in the wake of the outbreak of armed conflict at Lexington and Concord, Massachusetts. Unlike the First Continental Congress, the Second Congress faced the challenge of managing a rebellion against the largest empire in the world. Its increased responsibilities forced it to combine legislative and executive functions into one body. The structure of both Congresses mirrored that of colonial legislatures. It had a president, but this president was more like a speaker of a colonial legislature instead of a chief executive. This president could guide legislation through the Continental Congress, but could not designate delegates to committees or initiate legislation under his own authority. A secretary helped the president manage correspondence and maintain a journal of its proceedings. The Congress also had a doorkeeper, a messenger, and a few clerks that helped with the journal.
You know, when we look at our history books, they often jump from these First and Second Continental Congresses right to the bicameral Congress established by the Constitution in 1789. But you mentioned the Articles of Confederation, Terrence, and the Confederation government also had a Congress. In fact, it was really the Confederation Congress that took over from the Second Continental Congress on March 1st, 1781. So would you tell us more about the Confederation Congress and whether it operated any differently from these First and Second Continental Congresses?
Sure. Prior to the establishment of the Confederation Congress, really the First and Second Continental Congresses worked as an extra-legal body that had an ill-defined set of powers that grew as its role did throughout the war. Over time, the Continental Congress gained powers such as raising an army, managing the foreign affairs of the nation, and raising revenue. A number of delegates, however, wanted some form of sovereign authority that could guide the states on large issues such as foreign trade, but would enable the states to retain their sovereignty. As a result, the Continental Congress drafted a committee of 13 to spend 1 month producing a draft constitution for the colonies. The chair was John Dickinson of Pennsylvania, who was a relatively moderate member who didn't want complete independence from Britain, but wanted some kind of relationship in which colonial citizens' rights were considered within Parliament. As a result, really the Articles of Confederation was a codification of what the First and Second Continental Congresses had been doing from about 1774 up until the Articles were drafted in about 1777. The structural format of the Confederation Congress really didn't change all that much from the Continental Congresses. It just had a framework. It had more of a legalistic framework. There was some debate as to how much power the Confederation Congress should have versus that of the states. And you see some of that in some of the drafts that were produced for the Congress to consider. Ultimately, when the Articles were ratified in 1781, the format that was chosen was that the Confederation Congress would have a limited set of powers, more of an administrative guide for the states, whereas the states would retain almost full power as sovereign states.
Yeah, could we talk about the power of the Confederation Congress for a bit? You mentioned that the Articles of Confederation basically codified the First and Second Continental Congress's structure and powers in the Confederation Congress. So was the Confederation Congress like the Continental Congress in that it was a unicameral or one-house Congress? And what exactly are we talking about in terms of powers? What powers did the Confederation Congress have to make the national government run?
All of these entities, First Continental Congress, Second Continental Congress, Confederation Congresses, were all unicameral legislatures. In the case of the First Continental Congress, it really was a temporary body. They met for a month, produced the Declaration of Rights, decided on a mutual association to punish the British economically, but that is all the First Continental Congress did. The Second Continental Congress became a larger, more powerful body as a result of managing the war with the British. Some of the powers that the Congresses had was the Second Continental Congress and Confederation Congress. They had the authority to regulate the Continental Army, but in the case of the Confederation Congress, it could not compel states to help with supplying troops or funding its maintenance. It could request money from the states, but it also had no power of taxation. It could not regulate foreign trade or interstate commerce, so the states could actually enact their own policies. During the 1780s, the lack of centralized oversight hampered the nation's ability to pay down debt incurred during the war. However, one of its most successful powers was creating land policies for settlers to move further west. The Northwest Ordinances of 1784 and 1787 outlined the method by which territories would be formed and how they could apply for statehood.
Now, what happened or what changed on March 4, 1789, when the bicameral Congress established by the United States Constitution replaced the unicameral Congress established by the Articles of Confederation?
What made the change different really was what delegates used in compiling the Constitution versus what they used to compile the Articles. One advantage that the delegates of the Federal Convention had was that they had by that point, about 13 years of on-the-job experience between the First, Second, and Confederation Congresses to think about and decide how a national government would function. Really, throughout its history, the Continental Congresses and Confederation Congress lurched from challenge to challenge, such as settling the country's debts from the war, managing the distribution of land in the West, and existing basically in an imperial environment that was surrounded by the French, British, and Spanish empires. Much of that format was finalized during the Federal Convention in Philadelphia. With the transition, by July of 1788, the Confederation Congress appointed a 5-member committee on the Constitution to oversee the transition from the Confederation period to what scholars call the First Federal Congress period. One of those duties was overseeing the election of a president. Another was helping the states organize elections for House and Senate seats. The largest difference, I would say, between the Congress of the United States Constitution and the Confederation Congress was that change from a unicameral legislature with vaguely defined powers to a bicameral legislation of a House and Senate with specified powers.
Okay, now looking at the House of Representatives specifically, Matt, where and how did the early House and all of its members meet after it came into power in March 1789? And what kinds of processes and rules did the early House adopt and follow for its early meetings?
So first of all, as to meeting locations, the first Federal Congress was set to convene in New York City, March 4th of 1789. And they met at Federal Hall, which was in modern-day Lower Manhattan. Federal Hall no longer is standing. The original building's no longer standing. It was a rather simple space. The Senate met on the top floor, and the House, being the larger body, 65 members at that point, met on the lower floor. And for that first Congress, for the first and second sessions, the House and Senate were in New York City. For the third session, which met in late 1790, they moved to Philadelphia. And this was after Congress had passed the Permanent Seat of Government Act, which moved the future federal capital to Washington, D.C. But for the decade of the 1790s, it met in Philadelphia in Congress Hall, which had been recently constructed prior to 1790 as the Philadelphia County Courthouse. And again, it was a rather unadorned space, rather simple chamber, chairs and simple tables, the House meeting on the lower floor, Senate meeting on the upper floor. This gave rise, at least in that era, to references to there being an upper chamber and a lower chamber. It was the physical location of the Senate that led it often to the consternation of members of the House to be called the upper chamber. So it met principally for that first 11 years, briefly in New York, then Philadelphia, and then in 1800, the first wing of the Capitol building was completed here in D.C. And so in the 6th Congress, in November of 1800, the House meets in its first temporary chamber in the Capitol building, which was in the north wing. And again, it shared that space with the Senate and the Supreme Court and the fledgling Library of Congress. As for procedures, the start date is March 4th, 1789, but it takes the better part of a month for the House to achieve a quorum. On March 4th, there's roughly a dozen House members who are present out of the group, and they don't have enough to conduct business. And so they wait around for March. They're writing letters to colleagues. They're worrying because, of course, lack of attendance was one of the scourges with the Articles of Confederation Congress. But finally, they achieve a quorum on April 1st, 1789, All Fool's Day. There were a lot of members who also worried about the optics of that. It was a rather indecorous day to start. But they very quickly moved to electing Speaker of the House, Frederick Muhlenberg of Pennsylvania. That was on the first day, as well as a Clerk of the House, John Beckley, and very quickly moved to creating a special committee, what would have been a large committee at the time of 13 members, one from each state, who were to draft a set of rules of procedure. And if you know anything about the House, it has and always has had a very carefully constructed set of rules, which it adopts at the opening of each Congress. And so this committee met for the better part of a week and reported back to the House. And the first rules that they adopted were fairly simple. They filled a couple pages. Now, if you take the House rules and Jefferson's Manual of Practice, you're talking about more than 1,000 pages of rules and precedents. This was just a couple pages, and it touched on a couple things. First, the duties of the Speaker of the House, also debate and decorum, and another section which spent a lot of time talking about the procedures in the Committee of the Whole House, which is a parliamentary device that the House still uses often to expedite debate and amendment of legislation. And that had its roots back in the British House of Commons in the Stuart era in Great Britain, where the way it developed in the House was that the Speaker left the chair. In the U.S. House, the Speaker left the chair, and a chairman was appointed to act as the presiding officer. And in the Committee of the Whole debate, the process for amending was simpler. The idea was that members could talk more freely. Occasionally, the House would close the chamber down, the public galleries, and debate in the Committee of the Whole House. But it was used really to instruct very carefully a select committee, which would shape the legislation, report it back to the House, and then the Committee of the Whole House would again debate and amend the legislation before it went to a vote in the whole House. And this was a way for, over the years, over the centuries, for the House to amend legislation and oftentimes amend legislation that might be somewhat controversial. But it has its roots in the House of Commons, going back to the Stuart era, as I was saying at the beginning, when Commons would meet secretly and appoint a chairman to preside. And this was in an era when there was suspicion that the Speaker of the House was reporting back to the Crown about internal debates within Commons. So it has those roots. In modern practice, it's now the House uses it towards the end of the legislative process, not as intensively as those early Congresses did.
It sounds like for the early Congresses, legislation was a communal process or perhaps a team-driven process where a lot of members would collaborate on drafting a bill that the full House would either debate and pass or debate and reject.
Yeah, it was, because we didn't have a standing committee system. That only developed really in the 18-teens. We got a full committee system, and for a couple reasons. But what the House typically would do, the Speaker had the power at that point to appoint all committees. And typically, a committee was 3 members. And the House would very carefully instruct those members as to how they were to shape the legislation. They would go off, report a bill back to the House. And again, the House would amend and pass or defeat the bill, depending on the final outcome. But there was a kind of built-in wariness of centers of power or knowledge or expertise being built up. And so that was part of the resistance to having standing committees. We did have, in the first Congress, one standing committee, which was the Committee on Elections, which decided contested elections. And then over the course of the next decade, we get select committees that are formed at the beginning of each Congress. The Committee on Ways and Means, which becomes a standing committee within a decade, and also the Committee on Commerce and Manufactures. But it's really not until the 18-teens, with the War of 1812, with the need for specialization among the membership for certain committees, that you begin to see other long-standing committees come into being: agriculture, judiciary, naval affairs, and military affairs, which were the forerunners to armed services, the modern armed services.
Within the Continental Congress and Confederation Congress periods, committees were the primary method by which these congresses conducted their business. Most of them were ad hoc committees formed to further explore a legislative question posed by a member on the floor. Many of these committees had only 3 members, although some committees had as many as 5. Eventually, these congresses formed standing committees to consider complex issues that they would deal with on a regular basis, such as foreign affairs, commerce, or how to manage the war in an effective manner during the American Revolution. One of the Continental Congress's most famous committees was a Committee of 5, consisting of Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, Roger Sherman, and Robert Livingston, and this committee drafted what became known as the Declaration of Independence. The committee began its work in June 1776. They assigned Jefferson to write a draft within 2 weeks, and then revise the draft for presentation to the full Continental Congress in the Committee of the Whole in late June for deliberation and final passage.
We know from speaking with Cata Bartoloni Toisin in episode 40 that one of the first issues the United States Senate took up was the question of how do we address the president? So what were some of the first questions or legislative issues that the first House of Representatives took up?
Well, the very first piece of legislation that the House took up actually was an Oath of Office Act, what the prescribed oath of office would be. One of the earliest ones, and certainly a contentious one, would have been that Permanent Seat of Government Act, which was really a negotiation to some degree between southern and northern states about southern states helping to assume Revolutionary War debt in exchange for moving the federal capital to a more central location on the banks of the Potomac River. A major piece would be the Bill of Rights, what would become known as the Bill of Rights, the amendments to the Constitution, focus of James Madison, one of the earliest members of the House, and really just fleshing out the federal government itself, everything from creating a judiciary to the various federal executive offices. It was an amazing amount of work. And then internally, too, on the one hand, there had been a lot of precedent for these members to draw from. And certainly that was true when the framers laid out Article 1 in the Constitution. A lot of Article 1 is very spare. And part of that is because they had a firm idea of what legislative government was, because we had 170 years experience in the colonial assemblies, and then the Continental Congress and the Articles of Confederation Congresses, and beyond that, British Parliament. So they had a lot to work from, but there was also a sense, too, that they were embarking on something that was wholly new, and that the precedents that they were setting would affect later generations of legislators. The first Federal Congress Project, which is a great resource that your listeners should go to. Charlene Bickford and Ken Bowling for many years ran that project. It was based out of George Washington University. And it documents every last aspect of that very first Federal Congress, those 2 years. And one of the things they document are letters from representatives back home. And there was one from James Madison, which I actually pulled a quote out of. He wrote this in July 1789. He was writing back home to his father, and he wrote, "We're in a wilderness without a single footstep to guide us. It's consequently necessary to explore the way with great labor and caution. Those who may follow will have an easier task." So that first Federal Congress had a lot, both in terms of helping create that federal architecture for the country, but also setting up the internal mechanisms that would make the House run.
Earlier, when we talked about the office of the historian, Matt mentioned many different people who worked for the House of Representatives and really what we would consider to be behind-the-scenes roles. And after we take a moment to talk about our episode sponsor, I'd like for Matt and Terrence to pull back the curtain, if you will, on the House so that we can get a better idea of the key people who served these early Houses of Representatives. As today's conversation demonstrates, The historians of the House of Representatives play a really important role in preserving our memory of the arguments, discussions, memories, and decisions made by houses of representatives over time. But preserving dramatic moments in history is not always a straightforward activity, and then interpreting those records decades or even centuries later is not a simple matter either. So it's essential to our understanding of early American history to always place the records we have within the larger context in which they were created. That's why learning tools like the Great Courses Plus can be very helpful. For example, in the Great Courses Plus course, The History of the United States, which is now available in a second edition, 3 historians offer you a 30,000-foot view of all of American history, from Columbus right through the administration of President Bill Clinton. And about 24 of the 84 lectures in that course cover specific topics in early American history, such as the reasons why different European empires wanted to colonize North America, the creation of the First and Second Continental Congresses during the American Revolution, and the creation of the Constitution, which, as our guest just shared with us, led to the establishment of a bicameral legislature featuring both a House of Representatives and a Senate. Plus, the Great Courses Plus can help you expand your knowledge beyond the history of North America, because its massive course library contains over 10,000 lectures. And all of these lectures are given by award-winning experts on just about any topic that interests you, including history, science, religion, and the arts. Or you could indulge in a new hobby or skill like cooking and photography. Now, the Great Courses Plus offers all of its fascinating lectures in easy-to-watch 30-minute-long videos that you can stream, download, and watch all on your own schedule and on all your favorite mobile devices. Just download the Great Courses Plus app to get started. And right now, the Great Courses Plus is offering you a free month of unlimited access to all of its courses and lectures. To claim your free month of unlimited access, visit thegreatcoursesplus.com/bfworld. Remember, that's thegreatcoursesplus.com/bfworld. So Matt and Terrence, who were the first employees of the House of Representatives, and what kind of work did these people do for the early houses?
It was a much more spare institution then than it is now, for sure. There only would have been a handful of officers and staff. Congress-wide, House and Senate, there may have been 15 or 20 staff, no more. On the House side, of course, we had a clerk of the House, John Beckley, who was elected on the first day of Congress, along with the Speaker. And the clerk is a really important position because the clerk's the chief records keeper for the House. The clerk helps in the modern era, oversees official reporters who take a record of the debate. The clerk is in charge of the enrolling clerks on the rostrum who receive bills from members, and the reading clerk who will read bills coming before the House, and in the era before electronic voting would take a voice roll call for recorded votes. The clerk plays a really important role. In addition, the clerk, when the House adjourns at the end of a session, at the end of a Congress, it adjourns sine die, which is Latin for without day, and it essentially goes out of existence. And the one person who provides continuity between the Congresses is the clerk of the House, the clerk from the previous Congress. And the clerk opens up the new Congress, calls it to order, and then leads it to the election of the Speaker, who then, once that person's elected, presides over the House. So the clerk's a tremendously important role. Unfortunately for us, Beckley was not an archivist at heart. He was more of an organizer. And so one of his habits was to destroy original documents when they were superseded by perfected documents. So a lot of the early House records in terms of marked up bills or original resolutions that would have been introduced have been lost. Subsequent clerks are much different in the way that they preserve records. They are archivists at heart. But Beckley served off and on for almost 15 years and was certainly an important player. The officers of the House, the other officers, were a sergeant at arms who is in charge of the decorum of the House, and at that point also would have really been in charge of anything going on in the chamber. If the Speaker directed that the galleries be cleared, or there were members that needed to be rounded up, the sergeant at arms would go get them, but basically an 18th century security official. And then also another elected officer in that early period was the doorkeeper, who, working with the sergeant at arms, would control access to the chamber and also had some administrative functions. Between the sergeant at arms and doorkeeper, they oversaw payment for members per diem and for mileage. Later, another officer of the house will be the chaplain of the house, who opens up proceedings with a daily prayer. So the officers were just a handful of people. The clerk may have had a couple of assistants. The doorkeeper and sergeant at arms may have had an assistant each, but it was a pretty spare grouping. And then one other thing I should mention is, because we don't know precisely when the tradition started, but early on, certainly before 1820, the house had pages, young boys who acted as messengers, who would run resolutions between members and the chair or bring messages to members on the floor. We know that at least by 1817, there was one page. And these tended to be boys between age 8 and maybe 15 or 16. And it was a tradition that built up over the years. Originally, pages were picked based on their need. Many of them came from households where a widow was trying to help make ends meet, or they were orphaned. So in a way, it was a primitive form of social welfare, and they were paid on a daily basis like all the other staff.
One of the challenges that our office has is reconstructing some of that early history. And fortunately, due to the letters and journals the members left behind, I'm thinking of Fisher Ames in particular, we're able to reconstruct some of the early activities of what those House members did. We also have a wonderful archive of newspapers. I mean, I'm thinking of some of the newspapers from, say, the American Antiquarian Society database. There's a wonderful new database produced by National Archives and NEH, the Founders Online database, which enables researchers to look at the letters of various Continental Congress members such as George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, Benjamin Franklin. It's very searchable. You can search by date. You can search by recipient. You can search by writer. And so it's through using these resources that we're able to, read and research and reconstruct some of what the early House did.
Well, I'm not afraid to admit here that when Matt was telling the story of Beckley about how he was destroying the early records of the House, that my jaw dropped a bit in horror and shock, because that's like a historian's worst nightmare, people destroying records. So when and what kinds of procedures did the House adopt to preserve its records and preserve the documents of its history? And what are the guidelines that clerks after Beckley have followed to ensure that we do have a good documentary history of the House of Representatives and all of its work?
There really wasn't a standardized procedure for records keeping. It was really, at that point, largely at the discretion of the clerk, or the clerk's counterpart over on the Senate side would have been the Secretary of the Senate. And it's really not until the 20th century, with the creation of the National Archives under the General Services Administration, that there is a formalized process for records keeping in the federal government, period. The unique thing about House and Senate records, going back to the beginning, is that official records of the House are committee records. Those are the official records, and the records of some of the officers of the House as well. Now, in the modern period, post-World War II, those records have been kept by National Archives, but the House and the Senate retain ownership of those records. So a committee could call up its records from National Archives whenever it needs it. The papers of individual members are different entirely. That's their personal property. And so what you find in the early period, before we had that process with National Archives, is that in the 18th and 19th centuries, member papers would go to various regional repositories or their alma mater or a large local library. Oftentimes, committee records would go there, too, if they happened to be a chairman of the committee. So it was a bit of a hit or miss process. The clerks after Beckley there was a greater emphasis on preserving records. And the other hurdle for the early records of the House would have been the burning of the Capitol in 1814. The clerk at that point was Patrick Magruder, and the House lost a number of records also in the burning of the Capitol. So early records are a challenge.
In the case of the Continental Congresses and Confederation Congresses, preserving records, maintaining records was also a challenge. The secretary of those Congresses, he served for all 15 years of its existence, was Charles Thompson, who was a local entrepreneur who became a protege of Benjamin Franklin and John Dickinson. He was elected as secretary of the First Continental Congress, and it was his job to help the president of the Continental Congress manage correspondence. And Thompson was also responsible for maintaining the journals of the Continental Congress, which remained secret for a number of decades. Thompson was able to hire 2 or 3 clerks that helped him maintain the journals. He kept up to 4 of them. One of the journals was a secret journal. The secret journal is the journal that scholars are particularly interested in, but he managed about 3 to 4 journals at any given time. And Thompson's other challenge was to maintain and preserve these records for the Continental Congress, whether they were in Philadelphia or whether they were in other locations such as Baltimore, Maryland, Lancaster, Pennsylvania, York, Pennsylvania, which is where the Continental Congress went when the British took over Philadelphia. He followed the Congress to Trenton, New Jersey, eventually followed them to New York City. And he remained secretary up until the establishment of the First Federal Congress. Some of Thompson's methods for preserving words, writing words down, a number of members disagreed with how he did that, particularly John Adams. And some of Thompson's benefactors, once they left the Continental Congress, basically weren't able to protect him. So by 1789, a number of Thompson's enemies within the Congress made sure that he would not serve in the First Federal Congress.
Just to follow up on a few things that Terry raised, of course, the Constitution requires the House and the Senate to maintain and publish journals of their proceedings. And another thing to point out about the early House that was in some ways really revolutionary, the fact that within the first couple weeks, the House opened its galleries to the public, almost from the very beginning. The public and press were invited in to see House proceedings. And this was quite different from the experience with the Continental Congress and Articles of Confederation Congresses, which largely, if not exclusively, met in secret. And it really opened up not only policy debates, but the legislative process to the public in a way that it hadn't been open before. This was also different from the Senate because the Senate kept its doors closed for the first 6 or 7 years and met in secret session. And this had a practical effect that the House got a lot more attention in the press and in the public mind, particularly in that early period of the Republic, the first couple decades. It was the place where legislative initiatives were made. It's where the action was happening. Our good friend, the former Senate historian Don Ritchie, who wrote a book on press galleries in Congress, loved to tell the story of the Senate throwing its doors open and all the reporters rushing over to the Senate chamber to go see the proceedings over there. And within the first few hours, they realized how sleepy a place the Senate was, and they came right back to the House where all the action was. So having public galleries open was really an innovation.
Speaking of those public galleries and journalists, it seems like when we read the news today, we can find story after story about how divided members of Congress have become, given the divisive politics of our day. So how early did party and political divisions start to appear in the House of Representatives? And what are some of the ways that these divisions manifested themselves in early sessions of the House?
Really, the party divisions that emerged really go back to the Continental Congress and Confederation Congress. And really, these divisions stemmed from different views among the delegates about how Americans should relate to their government. So just looking at the Federal Convention of 1787, advocates of the Constitution, who were dubbed Federalists, believed in having a strong central government that promoted economic growth through large institutions such as banks. They also sought a mutual relationship with Great Britain. Alexander Hamilton embodied many of the principles of the Federalists. Advocates for the Articles of Confederation for a more decentralized government, who were called anti-federalists by their opponents, opposed Hamilton's financial centralization. And this opposition would coalesce into what was called the Democratic Republican Party, which was led by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. This group wanted to ensure that the central government would not encroach on the rights of states to govern as the states saw fit. And these divisions began during the Confederation Congress, but the first signs of political parties emerging, organized parties that is, emerges around 1792 and continues to grow through the 1790s. As for the House, we don't see parties sitting in specific areas or coalescing in specific areas until later in the 19th century. During this early era, members with the longest service seemed to get the best seats in the House. There was also an informal first-come, first-choose rule to encourage the early arrival of members, which was a chronic problem during the Continental Confederation Congresses that the House was attempting to fix. The first seating chart for the House that we see was published in 1819, but there were suggestions such as holding lotteries for desk assignments. By the 1840s, we see members sitting in party blocks, with Democrats sitting to the Speaker's left and Whigs, or Republicans, currently sitting to the Speaker's right, which continues to the present day.
Now, just how divisive did the politics and debates within the early houses become? Our history books tell us that the debates and politics of the Senate could be quite divisive, with the most famous example being the 1856 caning of Charles Sumner of Massachusetts. Did this sort of violence also happen in the House? I mean, did the debates in the House ever devolve into canings and fisticuffs?
Yeah, certainly by the end of that decade, tensions could run high. But the first major floor brawl that we know about happened in early 1798, and it involved two members, Matthew Lyon of Vermont and Roger Griswold of Connecticut. And outwardly, the fight started because Lyon, who had a reputation really for provoking Federalists in the Adams administration, one day in January of 1798, came onto the floor and was having a discussion at the bar of the House at the well near the Speaker's rostrum. And he went out of his way to insult the Connecticut delegation and the intelligence of their constituents. And Roger Griswold from Connecticut strolls up next to him and makes a cutting reference to Lyon's service in the Revolutionary War. Lyons had been accused of cowardice at one point. And Griswold said something to the effect that, well, if you go into Connecticut, carry your wooden sword, which was the symbol of someone who had been cashiered from the army for cowardice. And Lyon didn't hear him at first. Griswold repeated it, and Lyon was so shocked, he just turned and spit in Griswold's face. And this pretty much stopped the House in its track for 2 weeks. Members, largely along nascent Republican, Jeffersonian Republican lines, debated whether, in fact, Lyon should be expelled. The Constitution gives both the House and the Senate the power to set their own rules and also to expel a member for disorderly behavior with a 2/3 vote. So this was really the first instance where the House had to confront disorderly behavior. And the debate went on for a couple of weeks. There was a motion by Nathaniel Macon of North Carolina to censure Lyon, which would have essentially been the reading of a resolution stating how awful his behavior had been. Slapping him on the wrist would have been a mark of dishonor, but he would have remained a member. That was voted down, and the motion to expel actually got a majority vote, but it didn't get the 2/3 necessary. So Lyon remained a member. Roger Griswold, meanwhile, was steaming about this. And so in mid-February, a couple weeks after the original incident, while the House was organizing for a session, he came onto the floor with a hickory cane, and he caught Lyon in his desk writing letters or answering correspondence. And Lyon was wedged in, And Griswold struck him 20 times with this cane, really beat him. And he got up out of his seat, began to defend himself, eventually grabbed a pair of fire tongs from the fireplace. And by press accounts and by member accounts, because there was a committee that was created to investigate the second fight and took eyewitness testimony from a dozen or more members, these two jousted across the House floor, behind the speaker's rostrum. They fell to the floor. They wrestled. They were separated by the members. There was a consideration of expelling both of them. But in the end, both of them agreed, standing before the speaker, that they would maintain the peace. And I think after about a month of this, and if you ever look at the Annals of Congress, which is a precursor to the Congressional Record, it's rather spare in its account of anything going on in the House in that period. But the debates around that fight consumed about 80 pages of the Annals of Congress. I think members were so sick and tired of it. At the end, neither man was expelled. And in fact, neither was censured either. It was a really odd expectation that the institution, in a way, was not responsible for the dishonorable behavior of either of the two members. You know, you have to look back to this period, and this was the age of, the affairs of honor. And the expectation was that the House shouldn't be the arbiter. And in fact, James Madison, who was not a member of Congress by that point, wrote a letter to a friend in which he criticized Griswold, A, for not having beaten Lyon on the spot when he was originally spit on, or challenged him to a duel at that moment, that it was unfair to essentially have kicked the issue to the House. So the expectation was that you were going to be the arbiter of acts deemed dishonorable towards you. The House really doesn't have a system of discipline that it develops until the 1830s. We have the first member of the House who's censured for unparliamentary language directed at the Speaker of the House. And it's only really over a couple of centuries that we develop a system of disciplining members that involves expulsion, censure, and reprimand. But the Lyon-Griswold fight forced the House to think about that issue for the first time. And part of what lay behind that fight, too, I think, was something of class tension. Lyon he was an Irish immigrant. He had made his own way, successful businessman, but he was from Vermont, probably seemed a little bit of a backwoodsman to the other members of the New England delegation, the Connecticut delegation, particularly Griswold, who was from a distinguished family, and he would later serve as governor of Connecticut. So there was partly that rub. And part of it, too, was that they were from emergent political factions, not parties yet. We certainly didn't have parties. But Lyon was a thorn in the side of John Adams, President Adams, by 1798. He's actually tried later in 1798 under the Alien and Sedition Act, and he's convicted, and he goes to jail, and he actually runs his successful re-election campaign out of jail. And so he's a very vociferous member that the rest of the House probably was not sorry to see go. And he would become later the first member to represent two different states. Vermont was the first, Kentucky is the second state. And then later moves to the Arkansas territory and tries to become a delegate from the Arkansas territory. So he's quite a character. But the two of them had substantive policy disagreements, too. Lyon was very critical of the Adams administration's diplomacy towards France and the decision to beef up the military, whereas Griswold was very pro-Adams administration.
As we've heard, the House of Representatives has a really rich history. And as we all know, we've really just scratched the surface of that history. Matt and Terrence, is there a museum that we can visit or books that we can read so that we can dig a little bit deeper into the history of the House?
In terms of a museum, the museum within the Capitol Visitor Center is dedicated to telling the story of Congress, not only as an institution as a whole, but also a story of the House and the story of the Senate. It's located right here on Capitol Hill, and it's very easy to get to. It is accessible by the Washington, D.C. metro system, or if you prefer something like Uber or Lyft, it's very easy to get there. The entrance is right across the street from the United States Supreme Court. In terms of books, along with some of the publications that Matt mentioned earlier, on our website, which is history.house.gov, you will also find bibliographies with regard to different aspects of House history generally, bibliographies in terms of committees, and just different aspects of the history of the House that people can explore. And of course, we provide on the website some distillations of those stories through our blogs, through our historical highlights, and through some of the web exhibits.
Great. And before we head into the time warp, do you think there are any ways that the early history of the House of Representatives has informed how Congress and the House of Representatives works today? And if so, in what ways have those early houses shaped the present-day House and Congress?
You know, when I look back, I see a lot of continuity. In some ways, when you sit in the galleries in the House and you watch the proceedings on the floor, it's almost like stepping into a time machine. It's a way for us to peer back into the 18th century or even earlier. When it comes to practice and precedent on the floor, a lot of what happens now derives from those really early Congresses. I like to think if someone like James Madison or Fisher Ames were plopped down into the gallery, they'd find a lot that's comfortably familiar in one sense. They'd be surprised by the diversity of the membership. They wouldn't know what the television cameras were for or the electronic voting system. They might be surprised by the size of the place, although they certainly anticipated it was going to grow. But the processes, the rules, the role of the speaker or presiding officer, the approval of the journal, committee of the whole, just the pace and the atmosphere in the chamber, all these things would be, instantly recognizable, and they certainly have been durable. And also, particularly for someone like Madison, who, as the father of the Constitution, envisioned that the House was going to have this role where it was going to be, recalling his words, it would have an intimate sympathy with and dependence on the people. It certainly has been the branch of government that has, I think, most closely reflected the American people, certainly in its size. We've had more than 11,000 members serve in the House. Compare that to the Senate, which is less than 2,000, or the presidency. We've had 44 individuals, 45 presidents, or the Supreme Court, less than 120 justices. And those people have become more diverse over time as the country's become more diverse. So, in that sense, too, I think the House is in many ways what those early members in the first federal Congress had hoped for when they took those first steps into the wilderness, like Madison said.
And one really wonderful aspect of seeing that continuity through time would be to, watch the opening day procedures of the House on C-SPAN. Just the call of the members elect to the floor, the election of the Speaker and the officers of the House, the swearing in of the members, the minority leader's speech, which came a little bit later, but also the Speaker's address to the body of members. All of that harkens back to the House's early history and its procedures.
And now it's time for the time warp. This is a fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently. In your opinion, what might have happened if the Constitution had not divided the legislative branch into two houses, the Senate and House of Representatives? How do you think the development and early history of Congress would be different?
I think we definitely would have kept going under the Articles of Confederation until the Confederation Congress drew up a different document. What's forgotten today is that quite a few of the Confederation members liked the Articles because of their fear of centralized power. Members such as Patrick Henry, George Mason of Virginia wanted certain tweaks, but wanted to maintain the protections that the Articles guaranteed to the states. Some of these points were raised during the ratification debates of 1787, 1788. There may have been regional blocks of mutual interest that developed among the states, particularly among, say, southern states versus states in the mid-Atlantic region or states within New England. Those calls for a guarantee of individual rights and states' rights within what became the United States Constitution were debated extensively at the Federal Convention and even afterwards. And this is what compelled Congress to draft 9 additional amendments that became the Bill of Rights. This became a particular mission for James Madison.
Earlier, you told us that there are exhibits about the history of Congress and the House of Representatives that we can visit and go see at the U.S. Capitol Visitor Center. Are there any special exhibits or exhibitions coming up about the history of the House that we should try and make it a point to come see? Or do you have any special online exhibitions or articles that we should make it a point to check out and read?
On the website, I would point to two of our exhibits in particular, one called What's in the Capitol and another exhibit called the Tourist Capital. And one of the challenges that we face within the office is, how can we bring the House to people who aren't in Washington, D.C.? And one of the things that we uncovered was that we noticed throughout the 19th century that local touring groups would create these wonderful publications, either in print or you would have stereo views so that people could see, what's in the Capitol, what to look for. If you're a tourist, what should you look at first? Where should you go first? So we decided to bring this concept into the 21st century through both of these exhibits. And what these exhibits are basically descriptions of different parts of the Capitol, such as Statuary Hall, which was the old Hall of the House from about 1819 to 1857. We talk about the current House chamber. We describe some of the House office buildings because we notice that for a number of visitors, they may visit some of those buildings first as much or maybe more than the Capitol. Those buildings would be the Cannon, Longworth, and Rayburn House office buildings. So that was one of the efforts that we thought about and that we felt would be helpful to people who are not in Washington, D.C., or if they're planning a visit to Washington, if they want to visit Capitol Hill, then they'll have a sense as to what the Capitol looks like, how it's laid out, and how they can see what interests them the most.
And if we have more questions about the early history of the House of Representatives or its Office of the Historian, how can we get in contact with you or your office to pose those questions?
Listeners are welcome to visit our website, history.house.gov. Off the website, we have contact information. They can call the office at our main number, 202-226-1300, or they can send us an email, history@mail.house.gov, mail.house.gov. We answer a lot of reference questions, and we're happy to help people connect with the House's history. It's an old institution. It operates under some pretty long-standing and complicated procedures. We've had a lot of people, so we understand that it can be an institution that can seem a little bit monolithic and difficult to connect with. But the way we've structured the website, we try to give people a little bit of toehold to get into that history by helping them understand personal biography or an object or artifact from the House collection, because we work very closely with the curatorial and archives office, or in fact, a document that might be of historical interest. So we really do try to help people make that connection and understand and hopefully generate some interest by connecting with that little piece of history or little piece of material culture that makes them want to ask more questions about the institution.
Many of the ideas that we've used to structure the website actually come from reader questions. And one of the questions that we received often were questions about Continental Congress members who signed the Constitution, who attended the Federal Convention of 1787. And in response to that, we produced a web exhibit page that features the delegates of the Continental Congress who signed the United States Constitution.
Matt Wasniewski and Terrence Ruckner, thank you so much for taking the time to tell us about your interesting work and web resources, and for helping us explore the early history of Congress and the House of Representatives.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for having us on the show.
The early Congress was a bold experiment. Drawing on years of colonial and revolutionary experiences, early lawmakers set out to build a legislature that could balance power, foster debate, and serve a new republic. From the first meeting in Federal Hall and Congress Hall to the adoption procedures that we still use today, the House of Representatives became a proving ground for democratic governance. As we reflect on the 250th anniversary of the Second Continental Congress, it's worth remembering how fragile and how visionary those early efforts were. The shift from a unicameral Congress under the Articles of Confederation to a bicameral Congress under the Constitution wasn't just structural. It signaled a new way of thinking about representation, accountability, and the federal balance of power. For more information about our guests and the Office of the Historian of the United States House of Representatives, plus notes and links for everything we talked about today, visit the show notes page, benfranklinsworld.com 202. Don't forget, friends tell friends about their favorite podcasts. If you enjoyed this episode, please tell your friends and family about it. Production assistance for this podcast comes from Joseph Edelman, Karen Wolf, and Morgan McCullough. Breakmaster Cylinder composed our custom theme music. This podcast is part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. To discover and listen to their other episodes, visit airwavemedia.com.